The fluorescent lights of the courthouse hallway hummed incessantly, casting a cold, sterile glow that made everything feel lifeless and wrong. 8-year-old Emma Harrison sat perfectly still on the hard wooden bench, her small legs dangling above the gray tile floor. She wore a lavender dress that her mother had picked out, the one her father had said made her look pretty at breakfast. A lifetime ago it seemed. That breakfast now felt like it belonged to someone else's life, a life where families ate together and didn't use lawyers to communicate. Beside Emma, his massive golden head resting gently on her lap, lay Buddy. The golden retriever had been part of the Harrison family for 5 years, arriving as a puppy shortly after Emma was born. Buddy was more than a pet. He was Emma's first best friend, her confidant, and increasingly, her emotional anchor in a world that had become frighteningly unpredictable. His fur was soft and warm, and right now, that warmth was the only thing keeping Emma from feeling completely hollow inside. The sounds from inside the courtroom were muffled but unmistakable. Emma could hear the angry rumble of her father's voice, followed by her mother's sharp response. Even through the heavy wooden doors, their frustration was palpable. An elderly couple sitting 3 benches away kept glancing at Emma with pitying looks. Emma hated those looks. She hated everything about this place. The institutional beige walls, the smell of old wood and floor polish, the feeling that her entire life was being decided by strangers in dark robes. 8 months. That's how long the divorce had been happening. Not that it had started 8 months ago. Emma understood now that it had been happening for much longer. She'd just been too young or too distracted to notice. Her parents had tried to hide it at first, the forced smiles at dinner, the conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. But by the time they finally sat her down to explain that Mommy and Daddy were going to be living in different places, everything had already shattered. The first month after the separation had been confusing. Emma had moved between her parents' homes like she was being passed back and forth in some awful game nobody had explained the rules to. She kept forgetting to pack things, her favorite stuffed animal in Dad's house, her school projects in Mom's apartment. Her teachers had called her mother, concerned about her grades slipping. Her pediatrician had commented that she seemed smaller somehow, withdrawn. It was around month 3 that Emma had stopped talking much at all. Not deliberately, not as a protest, but because words felt too hard. What was she supposed to say? That she loved both of them but hated what they were doing. That she didn't care about custody arrangements and child support payments and mutual parenting agreements. That she just wanted things to go back to normal, even though she was old enough to understand that they probably never would. Buddy had always been there, but he became everything starting in month 4. Emma would come home from school, to whichever home she was at that day, and Buddy would be waiting. He didn't ask questions about where she'd been. He didn't tell her she needed to be strong or be the mature one. He simply pressed his warm face against hers and let her bury her fingers in his golden fur while she cried. Her mother had tried to take him once. During a particularly bitter argument, her father had insisted that Buddy stay at his house, claiming he needed the companionship. Emma had stopped eating. She'd refused to go to school. Her therapist, doctor, had finally intervened, explaining to both parents that separating Emma from the dog would be emotionally damaging. That's when her mother had backed down. At least they could agree on something. Emma needed Buddy. Now, as the sounds from the courtroom grew louder, Emma squeezed her eyes shut. She knew what was happening in there. They were deciding her fate. The judge would determine where she lived when she saw each parent and probably 100 other details that made adults' faces look serious and tired. Emma had asked her lawyer, a kind woman named Ms., what would happen in court, but her explanations had made Emma's stomach hurt worse. "I don't want to pick," Emma had whispered to doctor during their last session. "I know, sweetheart," the therapist had said, her voice gentle. "But sometimes in life difficult things happen and we have to be brave." Emma didn't feel brave. She felt small and terrified and impossibly sad. A woman in a dark suit hurried past, carrying a folder. A man in another suit spoke urgently into his phone. The courthouse hallway was a universe of adult problems, and Emma was somehow the center of it all. The irony wasn't lost on her. Everyone was fighting over her, but nobody was actually asking what she wanted. Or rather, they were asking, but they didn't seem to understand that what she wanted was impossible. She wanted her family back together. She wanted her father to laugh the way he used to laugh. She wanted her mother to stop crying in the bathroom when she thought Emma couldn't hear. She wanted Saturday morning pancakes with everyone at the same table, without tension crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. Buddy shifted his position, lifting his head slightly to lick her hand. Even at this moment, even sitting in this terrible hallway outside a courtroom, the dog found a way to show her he cared. It was such a simple gesture, but it meant everything. Emma heard her father's voice rise again, louder now, angry. Whatever was happening in there, it was escalating. She pulled Buddy closer, and he responded by resting his chin more heavily on her leg, a gesture of support that was more comforting than any words anyone had said to her in months. Her father's voice was followed by what sounded like a gavel, sharp, authoritative, final. Emma's heart jumped into her throat. Was it over? Had someone decided? She felt sick. Whatever decision was being made, it would reshape her entire world. She would lose something no matter what. If she lived with her mother, she'd see her father less. If she lived with her father, her mother would be the one waiting for her every other week instead of every day. There was no winning. There was only different kinds of losing. The courtroom doors remained closed. Emma waited, her hand buried in Buddy's fur, listening to the muffled sounds of adult voices arguing about who loved her more, when they couldn't seem to understand that she was breaking into pieces right there in the hallway, one agonizing second at a time. Buddy pressed closer, as if he could somehow hold her together through sheer force of devotion. And in that moment, Emma realized that this dog was the only person, the only living being, who loved her without conditions, without anger, without expectations. He didn't care which parent she ended up with. He just cared that she was there, that she existed, that she mattered. For the first time that morning, Emma let out a trembling breath and allowed herself to cry, really cry, into Buddy's golden fur. The courtroom was colder than Emma had expected. She'd imagined it would feel imposing and grand, but instead it felt small and suffocating, like the walls were slowly closing in. Everything was wood and stone and dark leather, expensive materials meant to convey authority and tradition. The high ceiling seemed impossibly far away, and the lighting made everyone look tired and sick. Emma stood in the witness box, a small platform that had been specially raised so the judge could see her. A court officer had helped her up, his hand gentle on her back, but his kindness only made the situation feel more terrifying. This was real. This was actually happening. She wasn't dreaming this nightmare. Judge sat elevated on her bench, wearing a flowing black robe that made her look like she'd stepped out of a storybook villain's imagination. Emma had seen her photograph on the courthouse website. The biography said Judge had been presiding over cases for 23 years and had one of the highest reversal rates in appellate court. That meant people were always challenging her decisions, which probably meant she was very, very good at her job. It also meant she was not the kind of person who would be patient with a terrified 8-year-old who couldn't find her voice. Emma's father sat at one table with his lawyer, Mr. Mitchell, a tall man with slick-back hair who looked like he stepped out of a television show. Her mother sat at the opposite table with her lawyer, Ms. Susan Brooks, a woman with kind eyes who had actually smiled at Emma, unlike most of the adults in this building. The judge looked over her reading glasses at Emma and spoke in a voice that seemed to boom across the courtroom despite its moderate volume. "Emma Harrison, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Emma opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her throat felt like it had closed up completely, as if her body had decided to protect her by simply refusing to participate in this process. She nodded instead, a small, jerky movement of her head. "I need a verbal response, please," Judge said, her tone already suggesting impatience. "Why, yes," Emma managed, her voice barely a whisper. The court reporter, a woman with perfectly manicured nails sitting at a small machine, looked up briefly. Emma wondered if she was typing, if there was now an official record that Emma Harrison's first testimony was reduced to a stammered single syllable. Judge shuffled through some papers on her bench. "Emma, I'm going to ask you some questions about your living situation. I want you to answer honestly, okay? These questions might be difficult, but it's important that I understand your feelings." The judge's tone was stern but not unkind. Emma could see that Judge was trying to be fair, trying to make this easier, but there was no way to make this easy. There was no way to make choosing between your parents feel anything but impossible. "Emma, do you understand what custody means?" the judge asked. Emma nodded, then caught herself. "Yes," she whispered. "Can you explain it to me?" Emma's mind went completely blank. Custody. She knew it meant which parent she would live with. She'd looked it up on her mother's computer when she thought no one was watching. But explaining it out loud in front of all these people made it feel too real. "It means where I live," Emma said finally, the words coming out slowly and painfully. "That's correct," Judge said, making a note. "Now, Emma, I need to ask you a very important question, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Are you ready?" Emma's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She could feel everyone in the courtroom watching her. In the gallery behind them, there were several people she didn't recognize, court observers, probably, or journalists. There were also her maternal grandmother and her paternal uncle, both looking like they hadn't slept in days. "If you could choose," Judge said slowly and deliberately, "would you prefer to live with your mother or your father?" The question hung in the air like a physical thing. Emma could feel its weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. She looked at her mother first. Her mother's eyes were red and swollen from crying. She'd been crying a lot lately. Her hands were clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white. Emma could see her mother's lips moving slightly, as if she was silently begging Emma to choose her. Then Emma looked at her father. His expression was different, angrier, more determined. His jaw was clenched, and he was staring at Emma with an intensity that made her feel like he was trying to will her to pick him. This was important to him in a way that scared Emma. It wasn't about what was best for Emma, it was about winning. Emma opened her mouth. Her voice simply refused to work. "Emma," Judge prompted, "can you answer the question?" Emma tried again. She could feel the panic rising in her chest like flood water. If she said she wanted to live with her mother, her father would look devastated. He would feel rejected, abandoned. But if she said her father, her mother would be heartbroken. Either way, she was going to hurt someone she loved desperately. The impossibility of it made her chest feel tight. Emma started. Her voice cracked. She could feel tears gathering in her eyes, but she was determined not to cry. She had to be strong. She had to get through this. Seconds passed, then more seconds. Emma realized she was shaking, actually physically trembling. The world around her seemed to tilt sideways. She gripped the edge of the witness box with both hands to steady herself. "Emma, I understand this is difficult," Judge said, and Emma detected something new in her tone, a hint of frustration. "But I need an answer. Do you want to live with your mother or your father?" Emma's mouth opened and closed silently. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run away. She wanted to go back to a time when her biggest worry was whether Buddy got enough treats or if she'd spelled encyclopedia correctly on her spelling test. Her mother leaned forward. "Your Honor, perhaps." "I need to hear from Emma," Judge interrupted, holding up a hand. Emma tried one more time. I don't." The words wouldn't come. The answer she knew she should give, the answer that would satisfy these adults, that would move this process forward, simply would not form in her mouth. Her throat seemed to have a will of its own, refusing to cooperate. The courtroom was absolutely silent now. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Everyone was waiting for Emma to speak, to choose, to determine her own fate. But Emma couldn't do it. She was 8 years old, and she was being asked to make a decision that would fundamentally change her life. The adults had destroyed her family, and now they were asking her to pick which pieces she wanted to keep. Emma's lips trembled. Tears began streaming down her face, unbidden and unstoppable. Still, no words came. "Your Honor," Ms. Brooks, her mother's lawyer, said gently, "perhaps we need to take a recess. The child is clearly distressed." Judge stared at Emma for a long moment. Emma could see the frustration in her expression, but also something else, a dawning recognition that this approach wasn't working. The judge had probably seen many children in her courtroom over 23 years, but Emma suspected she hadn't seen many who couldn't speak at all, who were too traumatized by the situation to even form words. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," Judge said finally, striking her gavel with a sharp crack that made Emma flinch. As Emma was helped down from the witness box, she caught sight of her father's face. He looked angry, as if her silence was a personal betrayal. Her mother looked devastated, but also sad for Emma, recognizing her daughter's pain. Neither of them seemed to understand that Emma's silence was the only honest answer she could give. Outside the courtroom, in the hallway, Emma collapsed against the bench where Buddy waited. The dog immediately pressed his face against hers, and Emma finally allowed herself to fall apart completely. The 15-minute recess stretched into 30 minutes. Emma sat in the hallway with Doctor, her therapist, while her parents remained in separate consultation rooms with their respective lawyers. Buddy lay across Emma's lap, his weight a comforting anchor that kept her grounded in reality. Without him, Emma felt like she might simply float away into panic. Doctor sat beside them, saying nothing for a long time. She was a petite woman in her mid-50s with warm brown eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She'd been seeing Emma twice a week for the past 4 months, ever since the initial separation. In that time, she'd witnessed Emma's deterioration. The way the girl had become smaller somehow, more insubstantial, like she was slowly fatting away. "Emma," Doctor said finally, her voice gentle, "I want to try something different, but I need your permission first." Emma looked at her, eyes red and puffy from crying. "What?" she whispered. "I think your voice is stuck right now," Doctor explained. "That's not unusual when a person, especially someone as young as you, is experiencing this level of emotional trauma. Your mind is protecting you by shutting down communication. It's a survival mechanism." Emma didn't really understand, but she appreciated that Doctor was treating her like an intelligent person, rather than a small, broken thing. "I have an idea that might help you communicate with the judge," Doctor continued, "but it's going to require me to ask for something very unusual, something the judge probably won't want to allow. Are you willing to try?" Emma nodded eagerly. Anything was better than sitting in that witness box, suffocating under the weight of an impossible question. Doctor stood up and walked toward the courtroom, her sensible brown shoes making soft clicking sounds on the tile floor. She returned a few minutes later with both lawyers and the judge's bailiff. Emma's stomach dropped. Something important was about to happen. The group gathered in a circle, speaking in low voices. Emma caught fragments of their conversation, highly irregular, never done this before, could compromise the proceedings, therapeutic intervention, best interest of the child. Finally, Doctor approached Judge directly. The judge was standing near the water fountain, reading through case files. When she saw the therapist coming toward her, she looked up with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Your Honor," Doctor began, her professional demeanor perfectly composed, "I need to request something unusual, but I believe it could be crucial to these proceedings." Judge closed her file and gave the therapist her full attention. "Go ahead, Doctor, but let me guess, this is going to be irregular." "Yes," Doctor admitted without hesitation. "But sometimes children respond better to therapeutic interventions than to traditional courtroom procedures. Emma is experiencing what we call selective mutism, brought on by severe emotional trauma. Her ability to communicate verbally has essentially shut down as a coping mechanism. I observed that, Judge said dryly. The child couldn't speak to save her life. Is this a medical condition? Not exactly, Doctor explained, gesturing for them to step slightly away from the others. It's a psychological response to an overwhelming situation. Emma loves both her parents deeply. Being forced to choose between them has triggered a complete communication shutdown. However, I've observed that Emma communicates quite effectively with her dog, Buddy. The animal represents safety and unconditional acceptance, things she desperately needs right now. Judge's expression grew skeptical. You're asking me to allow a dog in my courtroom. I'm asking you to consider it, Doctor said carefully. Emma has formed a secure attachment to this animal. His presence might allow her to access her voice and communicate more authentically. Without it, we're looking at a situation where the judge makes a custody decision about a child who has never actually expressed her preferences or feelings. The judge was quiet for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she considered the proposal. Emma could see the internal debate happening behind Judge's eyes, the conflict between maintaining courtroom protocol and actually getting to the truth of what Emma needed. This is highly irregular, Judge said finally. In my 23 years on the bench, I have never allowed an animal in the courtroom except for service animals. I understand, Doctor said, but this is an unusual case. An 8-year-old child's entire future is at stake, and she's unable to communicate because of trauma. If there's any tool we can use to help her express herself, shouldn't we consider it? Judge was silent for another long moment. She glanced toward the courtroom where Emma's parents were waiting, probably packing anxiously, probably wondering what was happening. If I allow this, Judge said slowly, it cannot be used as a precedent for future cases. This stays in this courtroom and we proceed with caution. The dog will be on a leash at all times. If there are any disruptions, we stop immediately. Do you understand? Completely, Doctor said, relief flooding her features. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me yet, Judge said. I'm still not entirely convinced this isn't a mistake, but I've been practicing law long enough to know when traditional methods aren't working. And that girl in there. The judge gestured vaguely toward the hallway where Emma waited. Something about her situation demands we try something different. Word traveled quickly. Within minutes, Emma's mother and father had both been informed of the plan. Her father's lawyer objected strenuously, arguing that allowing the dog would compromise the integrity of the proceedings and improperly influence the child's testimony. Ms. Brooks, Emma's mother's lawyer, was more thoughtful, consulting with her client before nodding her agreement. Emma's father looked furious. "This is manipulation," he said loudly enough for Emma to hear from the hallway. "The dog will bias Emma toward whoever she associates with the animal. This is completely unfair." But Judge had already made her decision. Emma heard the judge's voice carrying into the hallway. "The dog comes in, or we have a mistrial. Those are your options, Mr. Mitchell. Choose." Doctor came to Emma with a grave expression. "Emma, the judge has agreed to let Buddy come into the courtroom with you. This is very unusual, but it's going to help you be brave. Do you understand?" Emma nodded, relief washing through her body. The idea of having Buddy in the courtroom felt like a lifeline had been thrown to her in an ocean of despair. "There are rules, though," Doctor continued. "Buddy has to stay on his leash. You can't play with him or pet him excessively. The judge needs to see that you're still testifying seriously. Can you do that?" "Yes," Emma whispered, her first clear word in what felt like hours. "Good girl," Doctor said, squeezing her hand. As preparations were made to bring Buddy into the courtroom, Emma felt something shift inside her. It was subtle but significant, a small spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find her voice with her best friend by her side. The adults had created this impossible situation, but at least one of them, Judge, had recognized that Emma needed something more than legal procedure. She needed the one being in the world who loved her unconditionally. In the hallway, as Buddy was being prepared to enter the courtroom, Emma buried her face in his fur one more time. "Please help me," she whispered to the dog. "I don't know what to say, but maybe you can help me figure it out." Buddy licked her face, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Emma felt a tiny spark of possibility ignite in her chest. The courtroom doors opened slowly, deliberately, as if even the physical structure of the building understood the significance of what was about to happen. A court officer led Buddy through on a soft leather leash, the dog's golden fur catching the harsh fluorescent light and seeming to glow. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Emma could feel the collective attention shifting from the legal proceedings to this unprecedented moment. Judge sat perfectly still on her elevated bench, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp and observant. She was clearly watching how this unusual development would unfold. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her machine, ready to record whatever happened next. The bailiff stood near the door, positioning himself as if he might need to intervene at any moment. Emma's father immediately leaned over and whispered something urgent to his lawyer, Mr. Mitchell. His face was flushed with anger. Emma could see the frustration radiating off him in waves. He felt cheated somehow, as if the rules he'd agreed to follow were being changed mid-game. His hand clenched into a fist on the table. Her mother, by contrast, was staring at Buddy with an expression of dawning recognition. Emma watched her mother's eyes fill with tears. Her mother understood immediately what this meant, that Emma had been suffering so deeply that extraordinary measures had become necessary. Seeing her daughter's pain reflected in this way seemed to break something open in her. As Buddy walked further into the courtroom, his nails made soft clicking sounds on the polished wooden floor. The sound echoed slightly in the high-ceilinged room, and to Emma it seemed impossibly loud, as if everyone in the entire building could hear that a dog had entered Judge's courtroom, something that had probably never happened in the history of this courthouse. Buddy's head turned, his intelligent eyes scanning the unfamiliar space. He'd been in many places, parks, hospitals, other people's homes, but never somewhere like this. The formality of it all seemed to confuse him slightly. Then his nose caught a familiar scent and his entire body shifted. "Emma!" His tail began to wag, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. The sound of his tail brushing against the fabric of the officer's pants seemed to echo through the courtroom. Judge's expression flickered. Was that the beginning of a smile? It was hard to tell. The court officer led Buddy toward the witness stand where Emma stood waiting. Emma's hands were trembling so badly she had to grip the railing to keep herself upright. She'd been terrified. She'd been unable to speak. She'd been drowning in an impossible situation. But the moment she saw Buddy, something fundamental shifted inside her. The moment Buddy saw her fully, the dog's entire demeanor changed. His pace quickened slightly. His ears perked up. The professional court officer holding the leash seemed almost like an afterthought to Buddy, just an obstacle between him and the person he loved most in the world. Emma stepped down from the witness stand without waiting for permission. Doctor, sitting in the front row of the gallery, made a subtle gesture to the officer, who understood that Emma needed this moment. The leash was loosened, and Buddy bounded toward the little girl. Emma wrapped her arms around Buddy's neck, and the dog immediately pressed his entire body against hers, his head coming up to rest against her shoulder. For a moment, there was nothing in that courtroom except a little girl and her dog. No lawyers, no judge, no custody battle, no impossible choices. Just love, pure and unconditional. Emma closed her eyes and her entire body relaxed for the first time in months. She breathed in Buddy's familiar scent, the warmth of his fur, the faint smell of the dog shampoo her mother used, the indefinable essence that was simply Buddy. Her shoulders, which had been hunched up around her ears from tension, finally dropped. The knot in her chest that had been tightening since her parents told her they were divorcing seemed to loosen, just slightly. Around the courtroom, Emma could sense reactions happening. Her maternal grandmother, sitting in the gallery, was openly crying. Her paternal uncle looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. Several of the court observers had pulled out their phones, though the bailiff quickly held up a hand, reminding them that phones and recording devices were not permitted in the courtroom. Judge had removed her glasses again. Emma noticed she did this when she was experiencing emotion. The judge was studying Emma and Buddy with an intensity that suggested she was seeing something important, something that transcended the legal questions at hand. Her father's lawyer was on his feet, objecting. "Your Honor, this is a clear attempt to manipulate the proceedings. We need to restore order and—" "Sit down, Mr. Mitchell," Judge said quietly, but with an authority that made the lawyer immediately comply. "I'm watching something important happen. Don't interrupt." Emma lifted her head slightly and looked at Buddy's face. His dark brown eyes looked back at her with such pure devotion that her throat tightened. This dog didn't care about custody arrangements or legal precedents. He didn't care which parent Emma lived with, as long as she was happy. He loved her with a simplicity that the adults in this room seemed to have forgotten was possible. The court officer carefully guided Emma and Buddy toward the witness stand. Emma climbed back up and Buddy remained beside her, his body pressed against her leg, his head reaching up to rest against her hip. The leash was secured to a post near the witness stand, but it was slack. Buddy wasn't going anywhere. He'd found what he was looking for. Emma could feel the change in herself. Something that had been locked tight inside her chest was beginning to loosen. Having Buddy here meant she wasn't alone in this. She wasn't facing this impossible situation by herself. She had an ally, a supporter, a being who loved her no matter what happened in this courtroom. Judge was studying them both carefully. Emma could see the judge's expression had completely transformed. The stern, no-nonsense woman who'd been frustrated with Emma's silence just 30 minutes earlier now looked like she was seeing something that moved her deeply. "That's better," Judge said softly. She looked at Emma with something that might have been kindness. "Do you feel better with your friend here?" Emma looked at the judge, then down at Buddy, then back at the judge. She nodded. "Good," Judge said. She adjusted her glasses and made a note on her bench. "Emma, we're going to try this again, but this time we're going to do things a little differently. I want you to know that Buddy is here to support you, not to make this easier or to help you avoid difficult questions. You still need to tell the truth. Do you understand?" Emma nodded again, and this time something inside her felt different. Not better exactly, but more stable, more capable, more like she might actually be able to find her voice. Her mother was staring at Emma with an expression of such profound sadness and love that it made Emma's heart hurt. Her father was staring at Buddy with an expression that was harder to read, something between frustration and confusion, as if he couldn't quite understand why a dog was changing the entire dynamic of this courtroom. But Judge's eyes were clear and focused. She'd made her decision to allow Buddy into the courtroom, and now Emma could see that the judge understood something important. Sometimes the strongest testimony isn't made with words. Sometimes it's made with presence. Sometimes love speaks louder than any legal argument. Judge straightened her robes and prepared to continue. "Let's begin again," she said. "Emma, I have questions for you, and I believe with your friend Buddy here, you might finally be able to answer them." Emma took a deep breath, felt Buddy's warm weight against her leg, and prepared herself for whatever came next. Judge settled back into her chair, her fingers steepled together as she regarded Emma with a new kind of patience. The courtroom seemed different now, less adversarial, more like a space where something genuine might actually be able to happen. The presence of Buddy had shifted the energy fundamentally, though Emma couldn't quite explain how. "Emma," Judge began, her voice measured and careful, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. There's no rush. Take your time." Emma felt Buddy's warmth against her leg. The dog's presence was like an invisible shield, protecting her from the full weight of the judge's authority and the tension radiating from both her parents. "I'm going to ask you about what makes you happy," Judge continued. Not about your parents, not about custody, not about any of the complicated adult things. Just about what brings you joy and comfort. Are you ready to answer that? Emma nodded, but the familiar tightness was creeping back into her chest. Even with Buddy here, talking was still hard. Her throat still felt constricted, as if her voice had to push through layers of fear and doubt to make it out. Can you tell me, Emma, if you could show me what makes you happy, what would that be? The judge asked gently. Emma opened her mouth. A few sounds came out, small and broken. But the words wouldn't fully form. The old panic was rising again, threatening to pull her back under. Then she felt Buddy shift against her leg. The dog pressed more firmly against her, as if to say, I'm here, you're not alone. Emma looked down at Buddy's golden head resting against her hip. She could feel his heartbeat through his body, steady and sure and constant. In that moment, Emma realized something profound. She didn't need to use words to answer this question. She could show them. Slowly, deliberately, Emma raised her right hand. She moved it in a gentle wave, the kind of wave she might give to someone leaving or arriving or simply acknowledging their presence. It was a small gesture, almost casual, the kind of wave a child might make without thinking about it. But in this courtroom, in this moment, it felt weighted with intention. As her hand completed the wave, Emma's fingers moved down to tap gently on Buddy's head, 3 soft taps, right where his ear was. The gesture was tender, practiced, familiar. This wasn't something spontaneous. This was something Emma and Buddy had done together many times in the quiet moments when it was just the two of them. The courtroom held its breath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with the precision of a performer who had practiced the same routine hundreds of times, Buddy responded. The dog's entire body seemed to understand what was being asked of him. He shifted his position smoothly, his movements graceful and deliberate. Buddy lay down on the courtroom floor, a dog lying down in Judge's courtroom, something that seemed impossible moments ago but now felt like the most natural thing in the world. His body settled into a relaxed position, his breathing slow and steady. Then came the final part of the gesture. Buddy's front right paw lifted slowly, deliberately, and he placed it gently over Emma's heart, right over her chest where her heart was beating beneath her lavender dress. The dog's paw rested there, warm and solid, a physical manifestation of comfort and protection. Emma and Buddy remained frozen in this position, girl and dog, connected by the paw over heart, a gesture of pure, unconditional devotion that seemed to contain entire volumes of meaning that words could never capture. The courtroom erupted into complete silence, not the kind of silence that comes from absence of sound, but the kind that comes from everyone holding their breath simultaneously. It was the silence of people witnessing something profound and sacred. Emma's mother made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. Her hand covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. She was seeing, perhaps for the first time since the divorce had begun, the depth of her daughter's emotional trauma. She was seeing what her little girl needed, what she'd been trying to communicate all along. Her father's expression was more complicated. He was still angry, still frustrated, but Emma could see something else breaking through, a recognition of something he'd been missing. His jaw unclenched slightly, and he leaned back in his chair as if he'd been physically struck. Judge had gone completely still. Her eyes were fixed on the image of Emma and Buddy, and tears were streaming down her weathered face. One tear rolled down her cheek, then another. The judge, who had maintained perfect composure through thousands of cases, was crying openly. The court reporter had stopped typing. Her hands were still, hovering over her machine, as if she was afraid that documenting this moment would somehow diminish it, would somehow reduce this profound gesture to mere words and punctuation marks. Doctor, sitting in the front row of the gallery, had pressed her hands to her mouth. Her eyes were shining with tears, but they were tears of recognition, tears of understanding that her therapeutic instinct had been correct, that Emma had simply needed a way to communicate that didn't rely on words. Mr. Mitchell, Emma's father's lawyer, was staring at the scene with an expression of dawning comprehension. He seemed to understand that whatever objection he might raise, whatever legal argument he might present, would pale in the face of this silent testimony. Ms. Susan Brooks, her mother's lawyer, was leaning forward slightly, completely focused on the moment. Emma could see recognition in her expression as well, recognition that this was the real testimony, the true answer to all of the judge's questions. Even the bailiff, a man who probably dealt with difficult courtroom situations on a daily basis, looked moved. His professional demeanor had softened, and he was watching Emma and Buddy with an expression of quiet compassion. The gesture lasted only about 30 seconds, but it felt like time had expanded. It felt like the entire universe had paused to witness what two beings who loved each other could communicate without words. Then slowly, Buddy his paw from Emma's heart. The dog stood up gracefully, shook himself slightly, and pressed back against Emma's leg, returning to his position of support and comfort. Emma's hand dropped to her side, and she looked up at Judge. The judge stared at Emma for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "That," Judge said quietly, "is the most honest testimony I have heard in this entire proceeding." She removed her glasses completely now and wiped her eyes with a tissue that appeared from seemingly nowhere. When she put her glasses back on, her expression had transformed entirely. The stern jurist was still there, but overlaid with something new, a deep understanding of what she was witnessing and what it meant. "Emma," Judge said, her voice wavering slightly, "you just told me everything I needed to know. You didn't use words, but you communicated something far more powerful than words could ever convey. You showed me what brings you joy, what brings you comfort, what makes you feel safe. You showed me what you need." Emma felt something release inside her chest. She hadn't known the answer to the judge's question before she made the gesture. But in making it, in reaching out to touch Buddy, in receiving his love in return, she'd answered not just the judge's question but all of them. She'd shown them what mattered most, not which parent she preferred, but what her heart needed to survive this impossible situation. Her father was staring at Buddy now with an expression Emma had never seen before. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something like regret mixed with recognition. Her mother was crying openly, her shoulders shaking with sobs, but they seemed like different tears than before, tears of understanding rather than desperation. Judge looked between Emma and her parents, then back at the little girl and her golden dog. When she spoke again, her words carried the weight of 23 years of judicial experience and the wisdom of someone who had just witnessed something that transcended legal procedure. "We're going to take another recess," Judge said, "and then I have some things to discuss with all of you." Judge sat alone in her private chambers, a room that had become familiar to her over 23 years of judicial service. Floor to ceiling lined the walls, filled with legal volumes, case files, and precedents. A large mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface typically organized with military precision. Behind the desk hung her diploma from Yale Law School and her official judicial portrait, a stern woman in formal attire, looking every inch the accomplished jurist. But that stern woman seemed to have shattered somewhere in the courtroom. Judge sat in her leather chair, her black robe still draped around her shoulders, and she was crying. Actually crying, something she hadn't done in public in so long she couldn't remember the last time. Her glasses sat on the desk beside her, and she held a tissue to her face as tears continued to stream down her weathered cheeks. 23 years. That's how long she'd been sitting on the bench, making decisions that changed people's lives. She'd presided over custody battles, divorce proceedings, criminal cases, civil disputes. She developed a reputation for being fair but uncompromising, rational but firm. Her colleagues said she had an almost preternatural ability to see through lies and manipulation. She could read people's faces like books, detect inconsistencies in testimony, understand when someone was hiding the truth. But nothing, absolutely nothing, in her vast judicial experience had prepared her for what she just witnessed. That gesture, that simple, profound gesture of a child and her dog communicating something that transcended all the legal arguments, all the testimony, all the careful positioning of two parents trying to convince a judge that they were the better choice. Emma Harrison had said more with a wave and a tap than she could have said in hours of testimony. Judge stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the city below. The courthouse was downtown, and from this vantage point, she could see the busy streets, the people going about their lives, completely unaware that a fundamental shift in understanding was taking place in this building, in this room. She thought about all the custody cases she'd presided over, hundreds of them. She thought about the children, some of them teenagers who'd been old enough to testify, some of them young like Emma, unable to express themselves. She thought about the decisions she'd made based on financial stability, parental fitness, school districts, support systems. All reasonable criteria, all logical, rational, measurable factors. But what about love? What about the emotional core of what a child actually needed? Judge pressed her palm against the cool window. Her hands were shaking. She'd controlled her entire career by maintaining emotional distance, by viewing cases as logical puzzles to be solved rather than human tragedies to be navigated. It had served her well. It had made her a respected jurist, someone whose decisions rarely got overturned on appeal. But it had also, she was beginning to realize, made her blind to something essential. She thought about Emma in that courtroom, the terrified 8-year-old who couldn't speak, whose voice had been strangled by the impossible situation her parents had created. The girl had stood in the witness box, surrounded by adults in expensive suits, in a room designed to intimidate and impress, in a legal system designed by adults for adults. And that system had failed her completely. Until Buddy. Judge allowed herself a small, sad smile. A dog, a simple golden retriever, had accomplished what all of her judicial authority and courtroom procedure could not. The dog had given Emma permission to be herself, had created a space where she could communicate without words, had reminded her that unconditional love existed even in the midst of betrayal and abandonment. She thought about Emma's father, sitting at that table with his expensive lawyer, fighting so hard to win custody. Judge had seen that battle play out 1,000 times. Parents who loved their children but were so caught up in their own pain and anger that they couldn't see what they were doing to those children. They fought for custody as if it was a prize to be claimed, a way to prove they were the better parent, a way to hurt the other parent. And the children paid the price. Judge returned to her desk and picked up the case file. It was thick with documentation, financial records, psychological evaluations, testimony from teachers and neighbors. All of it trying to paint a picture of who was the better parent, who deserved custody of Emma Harrison. But Emma had just shown her the real picture. Emma needed stability. She needed consistency. She needed to know that the one constant in her life, Buddy, wouldn't be taken away from her. More than that, she needed to know that her parents could stop fighting and start focusing on her. The judge's phone buzzed. Her secretary's voice came through the intercom. "Your Honor, everyone is ready. Should I bring them in?" Judge took a deep breath. She removed her tissue and composed herself, though her eyes were still red. "Give me 2 more minutes," she said. She looked at herself in the mirror that hung on the wall, the mirror she rarely used, preferring to think of herself as beyond vanity. The woman staring back at her looked older than she remembered. Older and sadder, but also somehow more real. The stern facade had cracked, and underneath was someone who had been carrying the weight of 23 years of difficult decisions alone. Judge thought about when she'd first become a judge. She'd been younger then, more idealistic, more convinced that the law could solve human problems. Over the years, that idealism had been gradually worn away by the endless parade of human suffering that came through her courtroom. She'd learned to protect herself by becoming harder, colder, more rational. But in trying to be fair and impartial, she'd somehow stopped being human. She thought about the other children whose cases she'd presided over. Had there been moments where they needed something unconventional, something that would break through their trauma and fear? Had she missed those moments because she was too focused on procedure and precedent? There was a soft knock on the door. Doctor entered, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes kind. "Your Honor, are you all right? Everyone is waiting." Judge nodded slowly. "I'm fine, doctor, just processing something. Please send them in. But I'd like everyone, both parents, both lawyers, you and of course Emma and Buddy." "In your chambers," doctor looked surprised. "Your Honor, that's highly unusual." "Yes," judge agreed. "Today seems to be a day for highly unusual things. I believe that's sometimes necessary." As doctor left to gather everyone, judge stood and straightened her robes. She removed her glasses one more time and pressed her fingers to the bridge of her nose. She could still see that image, Emma and Buddy, girl and dog, connected by something that transcended all the adult complications of divorce and custody and legal procedure. That image would stay with her for the rest of her career, she suspected. It would change how she approached cases. It would remind her that beneath all the legal arguments and courtroom procedure, there were human beings, often children, desperately seeking stability and love. The door opened again and people began filing in. Emma came first, holding Buddy's leash, the dog's tail wagging slightly as if he sensed something important was about to happen. Emma's mother followed, her eyes red but her face composed. Emma's father came next, his expression unreadable. The lawyers entered, followed by the court reporter, who would document this unusual proceeding in the judge's private chambers. Judge gestured for everyone to sit. There were not enough chairs, so some people stood. The room felt crowded, intimate, nothing like the formal distance of the courtroom. "What I witnessed in that courtroom," Judge began, her voice steady but still thick with emotion, "was a child communicating truth that no amount of legal testimony could convey. Emma showed all of us, what she truly needs." She looked directly at Emma, and the little girl met her gaze, with Buddy pressed against her leg. "I have been a judge for 23 years, Judge continued, and I have made many decisions that I believed were in the best interest of the children involved. But today, I realized something very important. I realized that I've been so focused on the law that I forgot about the person at the center of all of this. I forgot about you, Emma." Emma's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. "What you and Buddy showed me," Judge said, "is that you need more than just a parent with a good income or a nice house. You need security. You need love. You need to know that the important beings in your life won't abandon you, and you deserve that." The judge took a deep breath and addressed both parents. "I will be making a custody decision. But first, I'm going to tell you what I learned from your daughter today. And then we're going to talk about how to actually put her needs first, instead of your own." As she began to speak, Judge felt something shifting inside her, not just in this case, but in her entire understanding of her role as a judge. Sometimes, she was beginning to understand, the most important thing a judge could do was not to follow procedure perfectly, but to truly see the human beings in front of her and act with compassion. The judge's chambers felt suffocating with the weight of everyone's emotions. Judge sat behind her mahogany desk, her posture formal but her expression softer than it had been moments earlier. Emma sat on a chair specially placed lower than the others, with Buddy lying at her feet. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, remaining completely still except for the gentle rise and fall of his breathing. Emma's mother, Harrison, sat rigidly on one side, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her makeup was smudged from crying, and her professional blazer seemed to hang on her frame like it didn't quite fit anymore. She'd lost weight during the divorce proceedings. Emma had noticed that weeks ago. Emma's father, David Harrison, sat on the opposite side of the room, his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair looking out of place in the intimate setting of the judge's chambers. His jaw was clenched, and his eyes were fixed somewhere on the wall, refusing to make direct contact with anyone. The two lawyers flanked their respective clients, Mr. Mitchell looking defensive and slightly angry, Miss Susan Brooks appearing thoughtful and composed. Doctor stood near the window, her role shifting from therapist to observer to potentially mediator. Judge removed her glasses and cleaned them with deliberate precision. When she put them back on, her gaze was penetrating. "I want to explain what I observed in that courtroom," Judge began, her voice carrying the weight of authority but softened by genuine concern. Emma made a gesture, a wave, followed by a tap on Buddy's head. The dog then performed a trained response, lying down and placing his paw over Emma's heart. This wasn't a random trick. This was a practiced communication between a child and her dog that has been repeated hundreds of times. It represents a secure attachment, a bond built on consistency, trust, and unconditional acceptance. David Harrison shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "Your Honor, I still maintain that allowing the dog to influence this proceeding is—" "I'm not finished," Judge interrupted, her voice sharp. "What I witnessed wasn't the dog influencing Emma. I witnessed a child communicating her deepest emotional need through the only relationship that has remained stable during a period of profound upheaval in her life. That tells me something crucial." She leaned forward, her elbows on the desk. "Emma doesn't care about who makes more money. She doesn't care about who has the nicer house or the better school district. Those are adult concerns. What Emma cares about, what she desperately needs, is to know that someone or something will remain constant, that she won't lose the being she loves, that the world won't continue to fracture around her." Harrison made a small sound, something between a whimper and a sob. Tears began streaming down her face again. "During the divorce proceedings," Judge continued, "both of you have fought hard. You've presented financial documentation, employment records, character references. You've both argued eloquently for why you should be the primary custodial parent. But what you haven't done is think about your daughter as anything other than an object to be claimed." David Harrison's face flushed with anger. He started to speak, but Judge held up her hand. "I'm not finished," she said firmly. "What you did was create a situation where an 8-year-old child was forced to choose between two parents she loves. You placed her in an impossible position, and then were shocked when she couldn't speak. But her silence wasn't weakness, Mr. Harrison, and it wasn't refusal to cooperate. Her silence was a symptom of severe emotional trauma caused by the way this divorce has been handled." David Harrison stood up abruptly. "This is inappropriate. My lawyer will be filing a complaint about this proceeding." "Sit down," Judge said, her voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. David sat, his face dark with anger. Ms. Brooks placed a calming hand on his arm, as the woman shook with suppressed emotion. "I am going to make a custody ruling," Judge said. "But before I do, I need you to understand something. This is not about rewarding one parent and punishing another. This is about creating stability for Emma, and that stability requires something from both of you." She turned her attention to Harrison. "Emma will live primarily with you. Her father will have generous and consistent visitation every other weekend, alternating holidays and extended time during summer vacation. However," Judge raised her finger, "this is conditional on one thing." Looked up, hope and fear mingling in her expression. "Buddy stays with Emma," Judge said. "Wherever Emma lives, the dog lives. This is not negotiable. This animal is, effectively, part of the custody arrangement. The child's emotional stability depends on it." She then turned to David Harrison. "Your daughter's attachment to that dog is not weakness, Mr. Harrison. It's survival. The dog has provided what you and her mother have not been able to provide, stability, and unconditional love. If you care about your daughters, you will support this arrangement. You will encourage her relationship with Buddy. You will never suggest separating them or use the dog as leverage in any future disagreements. David stared at the judge, his jaw working silently. Furthermore, Judge continued, both of you will participate in family therapy with Dr. Not just Emma, but all three of you together. Your goal is to rebuild trust and create a co-parenting relationship that prioritizes Emma's needs over your own anger and hurt. Nodded immediately, tears still streaming down her face. David remained silent, his expression hard. "Do you understand, Mr. Harrison?" Judge asked pointedly. "I understand," David said finally, his voice tight. "But I want to be clear that I don't agree with this decision." "Your disagreement has been noted," Judge said. "However, I would encourage you to take some time to think about what your daughter communicated in that courtroom. She wasn't trying to hurt you. She was trying to survive." There was a long silence. Doctor moved to stand beside Emma, placing a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. Emma looked at her father, and Judge saw something flicker across the man's face, something that might have been recognition, or shame, or simply the beginning of understanding. David Harrison stood up again, but this time not in anger. He walked to the window and stared out at the city below. When he finally turned back around, his face had changed. His expression was crumpled, devastated, like a man whose entire worldview had just shattered. "I didn't realize," David said quietly, his voice cracked. "I was so focused on. I wanted to prove that I was the better parent, that I was the one she needed. I didn't see that I was making things worse." He looked at Emma, really looked at her, for what seemed like the first time since the proceedings had begun. And what he saw broke something open inside him. His face contorted, and he sank back into his chair, covering his face with his hands. "I've been hurting her," he said through his fingers. "I was trying to win her, and I was hurting her." Reached across the space between them, and after a moment's hesitation, placed her hand on her ex-husband's arm. It was a gesture of compassion, of recognition that they had both been lost in their own pain and anger, and had forgotten about the person in the center of all of this. Emma watched her parents with an expression that seemed impossibly mature for an 8-year-old. Buddy, sensing the emotional shift in the room, lifted his head and rested his chin on Emma's knee, offering comfort to his girl in this moment of complexity. Judge observed this scene, understanding that something fundamental had shifted. These parents weren't enemies anymore. They were two broken people who had finally recognized what their conflict had done to their child. "I think we're done here," Judge said quietly. "Doctor, I'd like you to schedule the family therapy sessions to begin next week. Both parents will be required to attend." She looked at Emma. "Your custody will be officially documented and filed by the end of today. But more importantly, Emma, I want you to know that you did a very brave thing today. You found a way to tell us what you needed, and we listened. I'm sorry it took all of us so long to hear you." Emma nodded quietly, her small hand reaching down to stroke Buddy's golden fur. As people began to leave the chambers, David Harrison approached Emma. He knelt down to her level, and for the first time in months, Emma saw her father's real face. Not the angry one, not the determined one, but the one that was hurt and broken and trying to figure out how to become human again. "I'm sorry, Emma," he said. "I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to choose. I'm sorry I forgot about what you needed." Emma didn't know what to say, but Buddy did. The dog stood up and pressed his face against David's chest, and the man broke down completely, crying for the first time in his adult life. 3 weeks later, Riverside Park stretched out under a brilliant afternoon sun, its green grass seeming to glow with the promise of spring. The park was alive with the sounds of children playing, families picnicking, and dogs running freely in the designated off-leash area. It was the kind of perfect day that felt almost unreal after the darkness of the previous months. Emma ran across the grass with Buddy at her side, her laughter ringing out clear and bright, a sound that had been absent for so long that it seemed almost like a gift. She was no longer the withdrawn, silent child who'd sat in a witness box unable to speak. Something had shifted inside her, as if the dam that had been holding back all her emotion and joy had finally cracked open. Her mother and father stood together on the grass, watching their daughter play. They weren't standing close. There was still distance between them, still hurt, still complexity. But they were united in their attention to Emma, and that was something that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Harrison wore a simple sundress, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked lighter somehow, less burdened, as if the weight of fighting had finally lifted from her shoulders. She'd started sleeping better, her therapist had said. She'd stopped obsessively checking custody agreements and visitation schedules. She'd begun to understand that the real victory wasn't having Emma to herself. It was having a daughter who was happy and healthy. David Harrison stood beside her, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt. He looked different too, less polished, less defensive, more real. The expensive suits and styled hair had been replaced with something more genuine. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd attended every family therapy session that Judge had required. He'd listened when Emma talked about her feelings. He'd learned to apologize without making excuses. "She looks happy," said softly. "She does," David agreed. His voice was still rough with emotion. Even after 3 weeks, it was easy to make him cry when he thought about what he'd nearly missed, what he'd nearly destroyed in his anger and hurt. They watched as Emma threw a ball for Buddy. The dog bounded after it with enthusiasm, his golden fur catching the sunlight. Buddy had become even more important to Emma over the past weeks. The dog seemed to understand that he'd played a crucial role in saving Emma, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that matched his importance. Emma caught the ball when Buddy brought it back. She was laughing, playing, being a normal 8-year-old child. But there was something different about her now, too. There was a resilience in her expression, a strength that came from having survived something difficult. "Doctor said Emma's doing really well in therapy," said. "She mentioned that to me too," David replied. "She said Emma's processing everything, the divorce, the custody battle, all of it, but she's doing it in a healthy way now." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their daughter. The awkwardness between and David was still there, but it was different now. It wasn't the awkwardness of enemies or competitors. It was the awkwardness of two people who had once loved each other and had inflicted pain on each other, but who were slowly learning to work together for their daughter's sake. "I've been thinking," David said carefully, "about expanding my visitation time. Not to take her away from you, but I'd like to see her more. Maybe one weeknight during the week plus the weekends, if that's okay with you." Considered this. A month ago, she would have immediately gone on the defensive, worried about losing time with Emma. But now she understood that more time with her father was good for Emma, that Emma deserved to have both her parents actively involved in her life. "That sounds fine," said, "as long as we coordinate schedules and keep things consistent for Emma." "Absolutely," David agreed. "That's the whole point, right? Consistency. That's what Emma needs." Emma bounded back toward them, Buddy trotting happily at her side. The dog's tongue was hanging out, his entire body expressing the simple joy of running and playing. Emma threw her arms around both her parents, something that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. "Can we get ice cream?" Emma asked, her voice bright and excited. "All of us together." And David exchanged a glance. A month ago, they wouldn't have been able to do this. The idea of the three of them, the broken family, being together in public would have felt too painful, too complicated. But now, looking at their daughter's hopeful face, it seemed like the most natural thing in the world. "I think that's a great idea," said. "Let's do it," David agreed. "Buddy can wait in the shade while we get ice cream." They walked together across the park toward the ice cream stand, Emma between her parents, chattering about her day at school. about a science project she was working on, about how Buddy had learned a new trick. Her words poured out like water from a dam that had finally broken, and both her parents listened intently, grateful for every syllable, every laugh, every moment of their daughter's presence. As they sat on a bench eating ice cream, Emma made the gesture again. The wave, followed by the gentle tap on Buddy's head. The dog, lying in the shade nearby, immediately performed his trick, lying down completely still and placing his paw over Emma's heart. But this time something different happened. Reached over and gently placed her hand over Emma's other heart. Then David did the same. The three of them, mother, daughter, father, connected by this simple gesture of love and protection. Buddy's paw rested on Emma's heart. His hand rested on Emma's heart. David's hand rested on Emma's heart. And Emma's eyes filled with tears, not sad tears, but tears of understanding, tears of relief, tears of healing. Judge would later receive a letter from Emma's therapist, doctor, describing the scene. The judge would read it in her chambers and find herself crying again, tears that had become more frequent since that day in her courtroom when she'd realized that law, while important, was sometimes less powerful than love. "Thank you for allowing me to find my voice," the letter would say. It was signed by Emma Harrison in careful child's handwriting, with a paw print at the bottom, Buddy's contribution to the correspondence. 6 months later, Emma's voice had fully returned by autumn. She was talking more in school, participating in class discussions, making friends. Her grades had improved dramatically. Her teachers commented that she seemed like a completely different child. And David had successfully implemented their co-parenting arrangement. There were still occasional disagreements. They weren't perfect, and their marriage had ended for real reasons. But they'd learned to communicate about Emma's needs first and their own feelings second. Emma spent weekends with her father and weekday evenings, plus alternating holidays. She maintained her connection with both parents while having a primary home with her mother. More importantly, she never had to worry about losing Buddy. The dog was always there, sleeping on her bed, greeting her when she came home from school, offering his unconditional love regardless of which parent's house she was in. Judge had quietly changed her approach to custody cases. She began allowing more unconventional evidence, children's drawings, therapeutic assessments, even occasionally allowing emotional support animals into proceedings. Her colleagues noticed the change but didn't comment on it. They simply saw that her decisions, while maintaining their legal rigor, had become infused with something new, genuine compassion for the human beings at the center of these difficult situations. Emma and Buddy became somewhat famous in the courthouse. Lawyers and judges would occasionally ask about the little girl and her dog, who had changed the way custody battles were viewed. Emma never knew the full extent of her impact, but that was probably for the best. She was simply a child who loved her dog and who had found a way to communicate her truth when words failed her. And every evening, when Emma made that familiar gesture, the wave and the tap, and Buddy responded with his practiced trick, laying down and placing his paw over her heart, both her parents would understand what Judge had understood on that day in the courtroom. Sometimes the most powerful testimony isn't made with words. Sometimes love speaks louder than any legal argument. Sometimes what we need most is simply to be heard, to be seen, to be reminded that we matter. Emma, Buddy, and David had all learned this lesson. And in learning it, they'd been given something far more valuable than a custody arrangement or a legal victory. They'd been given a second chance.